My name is Chris, and today we're looking at the Q Acoustics 3030i stand mount speaker. Welcome to the Vinyl Attack. Is there anything more symbolic in the world of hi-fi than a pair of speakers? Stand mount, floor mount, big, small, boxy, or odd, they always seem to be the topic of great debate, and speakers can dominate our floor space the way they dominate our discussions. Everybody seems to love a good speaker. If you're in that category, then you are in luck because today is all about speakers. Stand mount speakers to be precise. Not only do I have the quite attractive Arctic White Q Acoustics 3030i in-house for review, but I still have the Triangle BR03s here and an older pair of Elac Uni-Fi UB5s as well. What all of these have in common other than being stand mount speakers? Well, they're popular, they're well regarded in their own right, they're all roughly the same size, and they're all priced around the $500 mark, a widely accepted price range that seems to signify the end of the budget entry level and the start of the mid-fi upgrade level. Yeah, the Elacs are a little older and the newer 2.0 version will cost you about $700, but I don't have a pair of those lying around, and, believe it or not, I picked up my original pair of Elacs on sale for a mere $350. Deals like this are still to be had if you keep an eye out, so the way I figure it is, these three models are in similar ground. But before we start down that path, let's take a good look at the Q Acoustics 3030i. Priced at $469 in the US and coming in four colors, the aforementioned Arctic White, Carbon Black, English Walnut, and Graphite Gray, the 3030i is the largest speaker in the 3000 line before you get to its bigger sibling, the floor-standing 3050. Not wanting the 3030 to lag behind in terms of performance, Q Acoustics has engineered this speaker to have a more powerful bass performance in its relatively compact size to match its clear top end. Measuring in at 7.9 inches wide, 12.8 inches tall, and 13 inches deep, it seems this extra depth is what helps this unit to reach down to 46 Hz. Now, that's also the same frequency that the Elac and Triangle boast for their bass measurements, but something about the 3030i just has more depth to it, showing me once again that while measurements are an excellent tool for gauging a product's performance, it's certainly not the only thing. Compared to the 3030i's 13-inch depth, the Elac is 10.8 inches deep, while the Triangle gets a little closer, coming in at 12.3. Cabinet size can't be the only reason though, so I took a look at the dimensions of the drivers themselves. The 3030i, being a two-way speaker, has a 6.5-inch mid-bass driver which is made from impregnated and coated paper, and I'm guessing that certainly plays a part. It also benefits from the almighty trickle-down technology bonus that was first used in their flagship, the Concept 500 speaker. This includes a decoupled 1-inch tweeter to isolate the vibrations from the mid-driver and computer-aided point-to-point bracing to help maintain high cabinet rigidity and low distortion. I'd also fathom a guess that its more uncommon average impedance of 6 ohms with a minimum load of 4 ohms and speaker sensitivity of 88 dB might play a role in its ability to get the mid-bass driver moving quicker and thus producing a wider sounding low end, but I can't say that for certain. What I can say is that this speaker puts out a surprising amount of deep, rich bass for such a compact package. Bass, however, is not the end-all be-all of a speaker performance, no matter what you might have read on the internet. So, how did all the measurements, materials, and components perform when listening to actual music?
That, detective, is the right question.
Using my standard setup that includes a Hagel H90, my Clear Audio Concept turntable with a Satisfy black tone arm, the HANA ML cartridge, and the EAT E-Glow Petite, yes, that review is still forthcoming, and an older Panasonic Blu-ray player that functions as a CD player these days, I set out to check the performance of the 3030i using a wide range of sounds and musical styles. With the bass performance of these speakers being the topic of discussion on many a forum, I wanted to make sure that I listened carefully to the entire performance of the speaker and not on such a singular item. In my experience, pushing some AC/DC through your speakers at a moderately high volume is a surefire way in which to bring in some excitement. With the original pressing of one of their more underrated albums in my possession after a recent record show, I set off with Blow Up Your Video and let the speakers do their work. While Chris Slade gets much of the glory when talking about taking Phil Rudd's drum position for a while, I think Simon Wright tends to get overlooked, and so does the sound of his kit. Yes, this album is a bit of an exercise in reverb in its mix, but Simon's hi-hats are still very crisp and his ride cymbal shows excellent tone, especially in the bell. The various crash cymbals wash cleanly over the drum fills, and I never felt like I was missing out on any high-end clarity. His snare drum was snappy and appropriately deep for the era, as was his kick drum. I think drums and hand percussion are sometimes ignored in component reviews, and that's a bit of a shame because they can cover a wider range of sounds and frequencies than one might first think. For example, a fine group of extraordinary musicians called the New World Renaissance Band put out a few albums back in the early to mid-90s, and their inclusion of a hand percussionist made me take note of the 3030i's capabilities, as the clear and naturally reverberant attack of the hand drums Ray Dillard played during the Odyssey recording session were rich and bright and brought out the lovely tone of the drum. Of course, Art Taylor is quite a name in the percussion world as well, and his performance on the Blue Note Tone Poet remaster and reissue of Dexter Gordon's One Flight Up was powerful and noteworthy, particularly on the first piece on side 2, Cop in the Haven. The 3030i shows the immediate attack of the ride cymbal with plenty of transients, so the notes never died off before they should. This might also be the most natural and realistic sounding snare I've heard in a very long time. It just wasn't laden with compression or bogged down with reverb. It was just direct, powerful, and impactful. The toms and the kick drum all fell in line with the standout sound and made for a very compelling recording. When going over the finer details in a performance of a speaker, hearing how it can handle a barrage of sounds at the same time emanating through its drivers is paramount to the level of enjoyment that you'll have when listening to it. The oftentimes raucous yet sometimes surprisingly intricate guitar work of the Young brothers certainly fits this criteria. When you factor in the rest of the high-energy recording, the 3030i had its work cut out. In a couple of the more dynamic passages and intros, it was easy to discern the finger talk on the strings, that is to say, fret squeak, and I was impressed with how easy it was to identify both guitars individually, not only in tone, but in the mix. A part of particular note for me was the clear sound of Angus's pick attacking the strings aggressively during his lead guitar on the B-side track, Two's Up, one of their more dark and melancholy-sounding songs. In stark contrast to this was the speaker's ability to deliver with convincing authenticity the myriad of sounds from the extensive list of mainly acoustic instruments as played by the New World Renaissance Band. This group played pretty much what you would imagine they would with such a name. Accurate, beautiful Renaissance music with a wide variety of instruments like recorders, cellos, violas, percussion, harp, a lute, and oud, bonus points if you know what that is without looking it up, a dulcimer, and the vocalist Owen's personal favorite accompaniment at the time, the chitarra battente. When you consider that much of the music was recorded live and in one room, you can see why this might be a perfect album to test the acoustic playback performance of the 3030i. With a plethora of these instruments playing at the same time in any given song on the album Odyssey, it was easy to identify their sound and placement even if you're not exactly sure which instrument you're hearing. The bass sounded appropriately big and had a good natural bloom that is indicative of an acoustic bass instrument. On more than one occasion, it was very impressive to hear just how it could fill an empty space but never intrude on the dynamics and purposeful silence. It was warm, it was enveloping, and it was a joy to hear. Continuing with the focus of instrument placement and tone, I took notice of the horns on One Flight Up. This album was by far the highest fidelity recording of the bunch, and it shows. While AC/DC had a solid budget to make Blow Up Your Video, the remastering from the original tapes on the Dexter Gordon record was just mixed at another level. While the New World Renaissance Band had as capable performers and a wider range of instruments, they simply didn't have access to the equipment or the engineers that a national act had at their disposal. Because of this, Dexter's saxophone was lively and filled with texture. Every note was clear and natural, and it paired well with the other instruments. Perhaps most notably, though, were the duet parts played off of Donald Byrd's trumpet, remarkably so when there were harmonies. Even though Byrd shared the same recording space in the mix as the drums, the two instruments never clashed and neither washed out the other. More than likely because Art knew when a solo was taking place to lay off the power some, but also because the mix was just that exceptional. But while instrument clarity is of great importance, with most of the music you're likely listening to, vocals are going to play a key part. A fine gentleman and personal friend, Owen Fife has the distinction in my life, if that's really of any worth, of being the most professional and outstanding male vocalist I've ever had the pleasure to hear. His brilliant tenor voice never once went flat or sharp in all the many years I was fortunate enough to hear him sing, and even with which to perform on rare occasion, and he was as good in the studio as he was live. Because of this, his was the benchmark I used when grading the vocal performance of the 3030i. Owen's amazing voice had a natural saturation to it, and this came through perfectly clear in these speakers without ever being overbearing or distorted. The inflections, breaths, and sonics were all extremely pleasant, which is no small feat when playing what is essentially a clinic on male vocals. They sat well in the mix, being just in front and above the rest of their band and their imaging. Certainly, the Halo had a say in how this was done, but I can also say that the other two speakers weren't able to capture this performance quite as clearly. Yes, Brian Johnson's vocals on Blow Up Your Video performed better on the 3030i than that of the other two speakers as well, but in terms of gauging pure performance, Owen just took the stage here for me and the speaker passed with flying colors. Sadly, he passed away in 2012, but I'm happy to say that you're able to find his music on YouTube Music, Spotify, and Apple Music, so I would highly recommend that you take a moment after this video to go and listen to some. But about that bass I mentioned earlier, well, it really is impressive. The driving simplicity of Cliff Williams' bass lines on the AC/DC album drove each song forward with a solid heft and groove that kept the thing moving forward when the Young brothers were off playing parts that were a little more intricate. A word that comes to mind when trying to describe the bass guitar on this album is simply satisfying. Yes, this feels like a bit of a cop-out for me when it comes to an adjective, but it's just so appropriate. It had depth, it was clear in the mix, and it did what a good rock music bass should do: fill the gaps and keep things moving. Did this widely regarded positive review of the bass performance measure up? I certainly think so. Yes, the more bass head aficionados among you will still want to add a subwoofer to fill in the lowest range for your perverse needs, but as a standalone speaker, I'd say the 3030i is quite capable of being a solution all on its own. Not easily achieved at this money, but how much of this was the speaker and how much of this were the components to which they were connected? Let's take a look at how all three speakers stack up in comparison. The Triangle BR03, or BR03 as we all call it, is a very exciting and lively speaker. I was impressed with its sound for the price, but it could also sit right on the border of being too harsh in the upper mids and high ends at times. It certainly had clearer high end than the 3030i, but on occasion that could be a bit much for my ears, which are admittedly sensitive to those frequencies. On the whole, the BR03 had a little less low end, but it wasn't as drastic as I thought it would be by comparison. However, the vocals on both AC/DC and the New World Renaissance Band were thinner and sounded a touch hollow, but they were also a bit more clear in parts. I personally just didn't quite like the tonal characteristics as much. The imaging seemed a little less wide, but the BR03 did have areas in songs where it had the superior instrument separation. Strings were more articulate, and I noticed a more precise sound in the hand percussion in the Renaissance music. This wasn't all too surprising given the performance of the BR03 with classical and jazz music, however, noted in my previous review of this speaker. The cymbals on One Flight Up had a little more sizzle, and the piano sang a bit more in the brighter registers, while the bass was quicker but had less fullness. Overall, the BR03 was a little more cool, or perhaps neutral in its presentation, and just didn't have as smooth a mid-range as the 3030i, nor could it keep up with the powerful presentation of the Q Acoustics offering. With the Elac, it gets a bit worse actually. Yes, the Uni-Fi has a smaller cabinet, a smaller driver, and is a bit long in the tooth, but it's also still priced higher when not on sale. While once touted by many to be one of the very best buys around the $500 mark, when placed in direct comparison to the 3030i, the Elac just felt a little flat all the way around. The bass had a faster decay, and there's also less of it overall. There was less texture in the horns with Dexter Gordon, and while it did have a very even presentation, the Elac was just less lively, almost muted in nature. There was less attack and power on the drums with Art Taylor and Simon Wright. Vocals were cooler, a bit further back in the mix, and just less natural sounding. I'd imagine that much of this is due to the Elac's need for more power to drive the speakers being a 4 ohm impedance and a low sensitivity of 85 dB, but I had to goose the volume a fair bit to get the same decibel levels from the Elac as I did from the Q Acoustics. But not even the superior performance of the 3030i in comparison is without its faults. So, what didn't I like about this speaker? Firstly, this is a slightly warmer sounding speaker. While this isn't necessarily a bad thing, and I often prefer this tonal characteristic, you might not. So, you should be aware of it. It can also be a tad temperamental in its placement. You might want to try out a few listening positions to see what works best for you, particularly in the height department. I'd grab a few different chairs of different heights to make sure you're seated in the best position to get the best sound. Finally, the speaker inputs. While I understand that cost-cutting measures have to be taken when trying to gain this sort of performance at a lower price point, the plastic surrounds on the inputs just sort of announce, "Hi, I'm an entry-level to mid-5 price point speaker. Sure, you won't see these in your day-to-day listening, but it just sort of bothered me. So what is my final overall impression of this speaker? If your budget sits around the $500 mark and you're looking for an exciting, dynamic, and just overall fun speaker that is user-friendly and just seems to tick a lot of the boxes in the must-have list for Sonics at this price point, this is an outstanding choice. While I still think many of those more dedicated to classical and jazz music might enjoy the Bro 3's lively top end, the 3030i simply doesn't leave you flat in any area like the Elac, and you won't sit around listening to it wishing you were hearing more from your music. Thank you all very much to my Patreon supporters for helping me to continue to produce this show, and thank you all very much for stopping by to check out this review, and I look forward to next time.